A very good morning to all our panelists and our guests for today's webinar. My name is Tricia Yeoh. I am CEO of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, ISEAS, based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to our morning webinar entitled ISEAS ASEAN Prosperity Initiative Forum 2020, Post-Pandemic Recovery for ASEAN. And it's going to be held over 2 days, and it's an exciting lineup of speakers and topics that we'll have for this morning on Tuesday, as well as tomorrow, Wednesday morning. So before we begin, please allow me to tell you a little bit more about our ASEAN Prosperity Initiative, or API, that ISEAS has had as a project over the last few years. So the API was started to be a platform where we connect researchers and subject matter experts, private sector professionals, government officials within the region, within ASEAN, to build understanding and consensus in achieving greater ASEAN economic integration. So this particular forum is a culmination of the various research and advocacy activities that we've done over the last year. We've published a lot of papers on the various topics, including aviation, digitalization, tourism. Migration is going to be launched tomorrow, and we even have like a long report that's going to be launched in the coming week. So API is a bigger project that continues year after year. It doesn't stop now, but I think what's very exciting about this time is that we've had quite a lot of significant events that have taken place. For one, we've had the recent signing and ratification of the historic Regional and Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which Malaysia and 14 other members have signed recently. After many, many years of negotiation and back and forth, I think it is a very historic and substantial moment that we do need to congratulate Malaysia and the other countries on. So ISEAS has issued a statement welcoming the signing of this RCEP. We know that RCEP will have further effects of consolidating the existing FTAs and other comprehensive economic partnership agreements within ASEAN. And the agreement should offer new growth opportunities, especially for the less economically developed nations within the bloc. But there are still a lot of questions remaining as to the depth and the breadth of which RCEP would be able to have an impact. I think there are still questions about what businesses themselves will experience. And we have experts here today who are going to tell you the details of how RCEP itself is going to work. I think it also brings to question other developments. For instance, now that the RCEP has been signed, what is Malaysia's position now? And the Minister of International Trade and Industry, Datuk Sri Azmin Ali, has recently said in Parliament, for instance, that the position of Malaysia is to ratify the Cptpp, but there's no timeline given as yet. So that doesn't seem to be a priority at the moment. So now that RCEP has been signed, Cptpp perhaps goes out the window. But what would the panelists have views on those? And I think I won't speak for too much longer, but just a final 2 points would be that number one, so one, I mentioned RCEP has been signed and Cptpp, we're not sure. The second, the big thing that has happened as well is that the US elections has just taken place. We know that under President Trump, the Cptpp, of course, was not of a priority to the United States of America, but what will the new US president take as his own positioning in the coming years, in the coming 4 years? And of course, how will the US position itself with regards to the fact that RCEP has now been signed, which is perceived to be something that China could take advantage of in the midst of the US-China trade war. And finally, the question of today, of course, is about post-pandemic recovery. Yes, we have been able to flatten the curve in some instances, but Malaysia is currently going through this third wave. And we know that many of the measures, the lockdown measures, for instance, have resulted in unprecedented disruptions in the supply chain, regional human capital mobility and trade. And all this really have an effect on ASEAN. I mean, they all have an effect on things like RCEP. Yes, the RCEP has been signed, but what does that mean in reality when we're still struggling to emerge from the pandemic? And given the fact that there's no vaccine that's going to be available, commercially available anytime in the near future, what does this mean for the countries? And will there be reconfiguration of supply chains throughout the region, as has already happened? So that's where I will stop, and I would like to spend the rest of the next 1.5 hours, or close to 2 hours, in fact, on our panel. And today's specific discussion is RCEP becomes official. What does it mean to post-pandemic recovery for ASEAN? We have 3 very distinguished speakers who actually don't need introductions, but I will introduce them anyway. And I'll do short introductions now. But for the specific time when I'm introducing them, I will speak a bit more about their profile. So we have with us today Dr. Jayant Menon, Senior Fellow at ISEAS, as well as ISEAS, Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. We have Juan Sebastian Cortes-Sanchez, Associate Director at the Asian Trade Center. And we have, last but not least, Tan Sri Dr. Rebecca Fatima Santa Maria, Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat, and also, I'm proud to say, a member of the ISEAS Board of Directors. So we will be giving each of the panelists 15 minutes, and we will be going in the order that I just mentioned. So now please let me introduce in more detail Dr. Jayant Menon, who is working on trade and investment issues and economic development in the Asian region. So his last post was at the Asian Development Bank as lead economist in the Office of the Chief Economist. He was also at the ADB Institute in Tokyo from 2005 to 2008. He started work as an academic in Australia, spending almost a decade at the Center of Policy Studies at Monash University in Clayton, Melbourne, and has spent time in different appointments in various different universities, including Australian National University, American University in Washington, D.C., University of Nottingham, UK, and of course in ISEAS, Malaysia. He works on a whole range of issues that are highly relevant for today's discussion, including economic impacts of COVID-19 in Southeast Asia, COVID-19 and the poor, restructuring of global value chains in Asia, regional economic architecture like the AEC, RCEP, Cptpp, and so on. So if you have any questions, actually, you can actually start thinking of them as the panelists start speaking and presenting their views. There is a Q&A box at the bottom, so please put your questions there and not in the chat box. But now I'd like to turn the time over to Dr. Jayant Menon, who will be presenting some slides. So Dr. Jayant Menon, please.
Thank you very much, Tricia. And I'm very pleased to be here today. And I'm just trying to share my slides and to be part of this event, as well as API, which I've been involved in for a few years now and have enjoyed very much. So I have 15 minutes, so let me get right into it. I want to talk about a few things that will set the stage, I guess, for my other panelists that will delve in more deeply into the issues. So I'll start by talking about the current situation of COVID in ASEAN very quickly, and the impacts and whether in fact we are in recovery now, what kind of recovery, and what we can do to try and hasten or improve our recovery, economic recovery, and the role that multilateral organizations like RCEP and RCEP and so on can play in doing this. And I'll focus on one area, which is the opening of borders, which I think has lagged behind the domestic easing of measures, and it's probably time to reconsider that balance between domestic and border restrictions. And then I'll quickly sum up. Right, so as of last week, this is the state of play of COVID in ASEAN, and I think we can broadly put them in 3 different groupings. we have in the first, the country still struggling to contain community spread of the virus. And here we have the Philippines and Indonesia that are, still trying to flatten the curve, basically, and save their health sectors as they deal with the continuing high rates of daily infections and high death rates as well. Then secondly, we have a couple of countries that look to have managed control of the spread, but are now experiencing new waves. Malaysia, as was mentioned by Tricia, and also Myanmar. And so these countries are reintroducing curbs to try and keep the new wave in check. And then the remaining 6 countries, Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, seem to have things pretty much under control domestically, with local transmissions either very low or sometimes zero for extended periods. And these are the countries that are ahead of in terms of managing the pandemic. So 3 sets of countries, and then I guess these will impact how they're recovering, as well as what role they can play in moving forward in opening up. Okay, so before I talk about the forecast for growth in the region, I think this chart is quite useful, which I've borrowed from Richard Baldwin, in distinguishing between gross and net effects. So in the top panel, we have the familiar flattening of the curve, the pandemic curve image. And so in the bottom panel, we have the different economic outcomes. So the dotted red line in the bottom panel is if we do nothing. So of course, no countries are doing nothing, but even if we did nothing, we still have a recession because the pandemic creates uncertainty, reduces confidence, and the labor force shrinks simply through deaths. But we know that all countries are doing something to varying degrees, and that's the dashed blue line. That's the gross impact of containment policies to keep the spread in check. And so we have quite a deep recession. But what we observe in the real world, of course, the net effect, which is the dashed green line in between the two. And this is after government support policies to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. And these government support policies vary across ASEAN countries, largely depending on resources and fiscal space. And here we can see that the richest countries, if you like, are the ones able to spend more on supporting or mitigating the impacts. I think the term stimulus programs is a misnomer. You can't really stimulate an economy in lockdown, but what you can do is maintain a holding pattern, or what Paul Krugman calls disaster relief type aid, where you try and keep firms from going into bankruptcy or people from dying. Countries like Singapore can spend a quarter of their GDP in doing this. Malaysia, about 22%. Then you have countries like Thailand and Indonesia and Vietnam, around 10 to 15%. But then, of course, the poorer countries can have less capacity to do so, spending close to nothing, right? But the net effects that we observe in the real world take into account these mitigation efforts by governments. So here we have the forecast, the latest forecast from the IMF and the ADB. The ADB is a little bit more optimistic than the IMF. But let me focus on the IMF numbers because I think they're the ones that spend the most amount of resources in coming up with this. And they also present a view of the world. The latest view is that the world will contract by 4.4% this year. In ASEAN, they see the contraction around 3.5%, similar to ADB, and quite a sharp rebound next year, about 6%, or ADB is 5.5%. Now, the worst hit country is expected to be the Philippines at 8.3% this year. But interestingly, the other countries struggling with the spread, Indonesia, is the least affected of all the original ASEAN member countries at minus 1.5. And here the difference ties in with the response. While the Philippines, like the other ASEAN 4 original members, introduced prolonged complete lockdown, Indonesia resisted that. And so it was able to avoid a very sharp downturn. Unfortunately, the Philippines had the recession, deep recession, and is still struggling with the virus. So you got the double whammy. But most other countries that had introduced lockdowns have controlled community transmission. Right. But strong rebounds expected next year. This, again, from the IMF, is a very clear V-shaped recovery. China leading the pack in yellow. The worst hit countries are in blue, the advanced economies. The brown is the emerging developing countries, and the gray is the world average. Right. Those are the forecasts. Now, let's look at the actual numbers. These are quarterly year-on-year numbers for ASEAN. And I think you can see here again, broadly, maybe a V-shaped type recovery for countries facing recession. But we don't know the shape really because, some countries are still struggling with containing the spread. So it depends how they do that, to what extent they bring back curbs going forward. But now with the vaccine at the horizon, maybe things are a bit more optimistic. But you can see here that, the bottom seems to have been hit in the second quarter for most countries that have faced recession. Of course, then you have countries like Vietnam and Brunei that avoided recessions altogether. But the bottom seems to have been hit. Singapore has revised its third quarter numbers. It's up from -7 to about -5.8. So things are improving, but the shape, whether it's V or W or L or Nike, only time will tell. But the bottom seems to have been hit, and that bottom seems to have been hit actually somewhere around May. If you look at more high frequency data, like trade data. And here in these charts, you can see that around May or June, we hit the bottom and sharp upturns ensued, both in exports and imports. And in Asia, of course, because of the supply chains operating quite strongly in ASEAN, and also strong demand for PPE and health products, this has led to ASEAN performing better than most other countries, and generally developing countries performing better than developed countries. This also comes through in the data for different types of trade by freight, air cargo, sea freight, and so on. Again, the bottom seems to be around May, June, and strong recovery. Okay, so now let me move on quickly in the time left to talk about recovery, post-pandemic recovery, the theme today. And one area that I want to focus on is the opening of borders. So I think countries at the onset of the pandemic closed their borders before they introduced domestic restrictions. And then we have seen domestic restrictions on movement easing, especially in countries that have contained the virus, but even in countries that haven't, like the Philippines and India and the US, right? Domestic restrictions have gradually eased because of the economy. But international restrictions have stayed on by and large. And this anomaly, I think, is unnecessary, and it's time to narrow the restriction, narrow the gaps between the two, the asymmetry between domestic versus border restrictions. I'm not talking about a free-for-all, but a careful, calibrated reduction in international or border restrictions to catch up with the domestic restrictions. In fact, I think many countries that are experiencing new waves of infection are doing so because domestic restrictions have eased too fast ahead of international ones. And they've done that because they need to support the economy. Now, if we rebalance this to include some international restrictions, we wouldn't have to do so much on the domestic front to get the same impact on the economy. So I think a rebalancing can support recovery without significantly raising health risks. And we can see that the incredible impact that international border restrictions have had on the domestic economies, right? There's decimated the tourism sectors, hotels and related industries that supply the tourism sector, but also health tourism and also education services. The services sector, international services in general, have suffered greatly. So I think going forward, RCEP and ASEAN, again, the themes they're discussing today, can play a bigger role in this process of multilateralizing bilateral travel bubbles into regional travel balloons. And for instance, I think, we have like the Singapore-Vietnam bilateral travel bubble. The Singapore-Hong Kong bubble was supposed to start a few days ago, but has been suspended because Hong Kong is facing a new wave of infections. I think partly because they opened up dance clubs before they did borders, as I was saying earlier, but domestic versus international. You can start thinking about a travel bubble, a regional travel bubble in ASEAN involving the countries that have managed community spread. ASEAN, Singapore, Vietnam, to expand to include Thailand, and then perhaps, Brunei, then Cambodia and Laos. Slowly but surely, through harmonizing and mutual recognition of protocols, especially quarantine. So I think if you recognize quarantine or quarantine reductions or exemptions undertaken in one country in other countries, you could revive regional tourism to a greater extent. But not just regional flows, but also flows from outside the region. So a European tourist is more likely to come to Thailand for a holiday if the 2-week quarantine that he or she has to undergo also allows travel to neighboring Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam without undergoing quarantine over and over again. So I think flows from outside the bubble will also increase if there's mutual recognition of quarantine within countries, within the countries of the bubble. There could be a big boost in helping recovery. And then I think the countries that haven't controlled community transmission can recognize on a non-reciprocal basis these quarantines as well. They should do that, I think, to also help boost their economies. But they can't expect that there will be reciprocity at this stage until they control community spread. So Philippines can recognize the quarantine undertaken in Singapore or Thailand because they have everything to gain by improving their tourism sector. Currently, they're trying to increase tourism domestically, which is actually more risky, technically, than tourism from Singapore or Thailand, given the different community transmission rates. And RCEP then could bring in the Australia-New Zealand bubble and China and so on and so forth. Right. So I think I'm on time, hitting my time limit. So let me quickly conclude. I think we have probably hit the bottom in ASEAN for economic downturn in the second quarter, but the shape and nature of the recovery will vary by country and remains uncertain. A lot depends on how they contain the spread in countries undergoing difficulties and whether they need to bring back restrictions. But with the vaccine on the horizon, hopefully things will improve in a sustainable and resilient way going forward. And to help that process, I think a quick ratification and early entry into force of RCEP would be a good thing if 5 ASEAN and 3 non-ASEAN members ratify it. And it can support the growth of global supply chains. And we've already seen how they've played an important role in leading the recovery through trade in goods. But it's time to try and increase trade in services, not just tourism, but also health, education, and so on, and business-related tourism. A lot of businesses require travel to actually support their growth. You can't do everything by Zoom like we can in this field. And so I think the sooner we narrow the asymmetry between domestic and border movement restrictions, the better that we will be. In fact, such a rebalancing can aid economic recovery without significantly raising health risks. In fact, when countries decide on a balance between health risks and economic recovery, they can keep that balance, but find a better way of striking it by rebalancing what happens at the border and inside the border. So I'm not talking about changing that health versus economy balance, but rather how we reach that given balance. And that involves easing a bit more on the border compared to domestic easing that is already taking place. And ASEAN, RCEP, APEC can play a role in turning bilateral travel bubbles into regional travel balloons through harmonizing and mutual recognition of quarantine and other protocols to boost not just intra-regional flows, as I mentioned, but extra-regional flows. And this, I think, will be the key role that these agreements can play. But more generally, I think agreements like RCEP will have their greatest impact going forward if they remain open to new members, open to a link up with the Cptpp or the FTAP that APEC has been supporting in the past, and now perhaps will be revived, that China, that the President Xi Jinping, Premier Xi Jinping has said they will want to join Cptpp. So this sets the stage for the revival of FTAP, which brings US and China together in this region in the biggest, in a potentially bigger FTA. But it also must be outward looking, like ASEAN has been. So we must avoid a Fortress Europe type outcome, keep looking outward, multilateralize their tariff preferences and non-tariff accords so that they maximize benefits. So with that, let me stop there and thank you for your attention. And back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jayant, for your presentation. Very interesting terms that Dr. Jayant has been using, not just having regional travel bubbles, but travel balloons. And of course, RCEP needing to be outward looking. And I think that sets a very good starting point for us. Dr. Jayant has given you very good statistics, very good points about thinking about post-pandemic recovery. And I think essentially one of your main points was that you were very polite in saying it, but I think what you're saying is that it's time to open the borders or consider methods through which we can open the borders safely in order that we can, increase the integration or resume and revive regional tourism as well. So very good points. I have some questions, but we'll leave that for later. I'd now like to pass the time to Juan Sebastian Cortes-Sanchez, and let me introduce him. So Juan Sebastian is an associate director at the ATC Asian Trade Center. He manages and conducts trade policy and supply chain related research and works with clients on trade agreement optimizations and supply chain diagnosis. He conducts research on Asian trade issues, on TPP negotiations, e-commerce and digital trade, RCEP, global value chains, trade facilitation in Asia, and the ASEAN economic community. So he's well placed to speak to us today. I had the chance to speak to him earlier, and so Juan Sebastian hails from Bogota in Colombia. So I asked him what he's doing all the way here, but we're very pleased to have people who are interested in our region and who are experts in regional trade. Juan Sebastian will have some slides as well, so I'd like to pass the time now over to him.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you, IDEAS, for the opportunity to speak at this very interesting forum. Yeah, like Tricia said, Associate Director at the Asian Trade Center. We do most things trade related and policy related. And today I would like to take the opportunity to speak about RCEP and then what we see RCEP being in an environment of post-pandemic recovery and also broader economic integration initiatives in Asia as a whole. So the way I want to frame my presentation today is to try to understand RCEP in relation to the recently published ASEAN goals for its comprehensive recovery framework. And there's three particular things that I wanted to highlight. It's not all of it, but it's three things that I think are important. The first is the development of regional value chains and sort of integration of supply chains. The second one is deepening economic integration, so going beyond tariffs. What does RCEP mean for that? And then third is the digital economy. So digital economy has been all over the place. So what does RCEP mean for digital economy governance, integration of digital economy? So before I jump into any of that, let me just sort of very, very quickly run through, okay, so what is RCEP? RCEP is a lot of things, but on a very basic level, is a consolidation of ASEAN plus one agreements, so agreements between ASEAN and trading partners, in this case, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. India was part of the agreement until last year when they decided not to join for various reasons. It's the first time there's an FTA that includes China, Japan, and Korea all in the same agreement. So it's not just about ASEAN and all these other trading partners, but about agreements between those partners too. And it's a very long agreement. It's 510 pages, more than 20 chapters on everything trade, goods, services, investment, IP, competition, anything you call it. And in addition, there's thousands of pages of tariff schedules. I was just looking at the Korea tariff schedule and I think it's over 2,500 pages. So definitely a lot to unpack. And the main way in which RCEP is integrating all the trade agreements beyond a lot of the rules is because of its single rule of origin. So the idea is that if you produce within RCEP, if you source and manufacture within RCEP and your product is RCEP originated, then you can export differential tariffs. So that's sort of the main idea about the broader economic integration. So can you guys hear me okay? Yes. Cool. So touching on the topic of global value chains is, what does RCEP mean for regional value chains and supply chains in Asia for Asia? So RCEP, it's not the only agreement in Asia. Asia has an immense tapestry of multiple trade agreements with different types of preferential matter. This chart here only illustrates regional trade agreements, so not the tens and hundreds of bilateral trade agreements. So as it was mentioned before, you have the ASEAN or TIGA, you have the 6 ASEAN plus 1 agreements, that also include India, and then you have RCEP and the Cptpp, and increasingly the EU has an increasing network of bilateral trade agreements with multiple trade partners. That is all great, but from a firm's perspective, it's becoming increasingly difficult to choose the best agreement, even with RCEP. Let's take a look at the chart. You look at Japan. Japan is almost in all of the agreements. So, you're comparing multiple tariff schedules for Japan just to figure out which one is the best agreement. And I think for a small firm or a firm, comparable multiple tariffs, multiple rules of origin. So, every agreement has different rules of origin, so different requirements to meet those rules of origin. And then to add to the complexity, then you have multiple certificate of origin requirements. So there's different rules as to what a firm needs to do to be sort of eligible. So on the one hand, they might ask you to have a specific form. In the case of the ASEAN trading goods agreements, there's a Form D. If you want to use the China agreement, there's a Form E, and so forth and so forth. There's an RCEP form. And then there's an increasing drive to get companies to do self-certification. So it's given the companies the ability to certify. ASEAN just launched a self-certification program. Cptp has self-certification requirements. So just to be brief, it's increasingly complex, multiple tariffs, multiple ways to comply with these agreements. And for a firm to be able to optimize the best tariff, I think it's a bit difficult. And RCEP does add value to that. But I wanted to provide an example that illustrates why just moving into RCEP, it's actually not the most optimal thing for a specific firm. So when you look at Asia and regional production networks, what you often find is that these are very integrated regional value chains that source within and outside of the region, manufacturing one or multiple locations, whether it's China or ASEAN, and then export to consumer markets like EU, US, and larger ones here in the region like China, EU, Japan. So something like RCEP from a macro perspective seems like a great thing, because if I just meet the rule of origin RCEP, then I can just export into China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, which are massive consumer markets. So we have one example at ITC is peach jam, which is processed foods. A lot of countries make processed foods, but what I wanted to illustrate with this case example is like anything that you source from manufacturing in a region and then export elsewhere. So if you're a firm trying to sort out what is my best agreement to go into Japan, Vietnam, China, and Korea, I'm located in an RCEP location, an ASEAN location. We picked, countries that have very high import duty tariffs. So, there's 34, 35, 30%, 20%. So these tariffs are high enough that it might prohibit you from going into those markets. So the opportunities are great. So in here, we're comparing Cptpp tariffs, ASEAN +1 tariffs, and RCEP tariffs, and then figure out which one is the best as of now. So if we look at the entire table, whether it's into Japan, Vietnam, China, Korea, the ASEAN +1 tariffs right now are much better than the RCEP tariffs. They're either zero in the cases of China, Vietnam, Japan, or they're close to zero in the case of Korea. RCEP does drop those tariffs to zero, but they drops them into zero in a period that moves from 20 to 21 years in the case of China, 15 years in the case of Korea, 10, 11 years in the case of Vietnam. So if I'm a firm sitting in 2020, I can think RCEP is great, in 2030 or 2040. But right now, I'm probably just going to use the ASEAN +1. Then, and when you look at something like the CPTPP, which has rules of origin that are a bit more flexible than something like the ASEAN +1 agreements, it does give you preferential treatment into Japan and Vietnam under a stronger framework of rules. So if you're a firm that really cares about Vietnam or Japan, then maybe using Cptpp makes more sense because the framework of rules and the protections are higher. So without having to go into depth into what all of this means, I think what I just wanted to highlight is that from a firm's perspective, it's not easy. Even if RCEP comes into force in 2021, because RCEP does integrate all these other agreements, but those agreements might still give them better tariffs or preferential tariffs into those markets, for 10, 15, 20 years to come. So I think I wanted to highlight that. And in this chart, I'm not even including bilateral agreements. So as an example, Japan has a lot of bilateral agreements with ASEAN member states that often are easier to use. I'm not including what I mentioned, which are the certificate of origin requirements. So all the rules that I need to meet to be able to use the preferential tariffs. And I'm not even getting into service and investment commitments, which are going to take a while to unravel and are very, very complicated. So I think RCEP does a good job at integrating a lot of these things, but there's a lot to be done just because of different timelines and overlapping commitments. So moving into sort of a broader context, I also wanted to speak about trade governance in a post-pandemic world. So what is RCEP rules? And the idea of an RCEP Secretariat, which we sort of welcome as an idea, to the ability to have, in the case of APEC or ASEAN, a specific secretariat that can actually walk in through those rules. And that can also allow governments to engage continuously in all of these issues and develop rules into the future, I think is very important. But then what does RCEP mean for the development of those rules? In just three things that I think a lot of people argue are one of the reasons why intra-ASEAN trade is slow, or why trade in the region is not growing at the rate at which it should. The first one is ensure supply chain for essential goods remain resilient during a pandemic. I think the best example of this is the fact that ASEAN, with its limitations, was able to come together and put together a list of essential goods and guaranteeing that trade remain open. But then countries like Singapore and New Zealand, which signed a declaration with essential good lists, struggled to get other countries to come on board. And which type of countries do you want to come on board? Well, maybe you want to come countries like China or Japan to come on board in that type of declaration, because those are major agricultural markets. So by broadening the scope of the countries that you have, you open opportunities to have broader dialogues about what type of rules can take in place in the case of a pandemic. In terms of identifying and eliminating non-tariff barriers, I think most businesses trading in the region will tell you that tariffs are not the main reason why they don't operate in the market or why they find it difficult to operate in a particular market. ASEAN has struggled and made a lot of progress in that regard. What role does RCEP play in the development of rules regarding things like technical standards, intellectual property, government procurement, and taxation, some of which are included in RCEP, but that are still very, very thin in terms of the commitments and the text, but have the potential to grow. And the last one is trade facilitation and procedural obstacles. I think something that characterizes the region is that there's widening development levels, and the ability for Singapore and Korea to have in place paperless trade legislations and single windows and make the process of import and export is seamless is completely different than the ability of the CLM countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, or the regulatory complexity of China, right? So I think it's interesting to think about how does RCEP allow different members to streamline those processes and actually make it easier. Because the case is still the case that regardless of existing trade agreements, a business needs to become deeply familiar with the customs, trade, documentation requirements of each of the legislations to be able to operate in those legislations. So how does RCEP streamline those rules? So opening those questions, happy to discuss any of these moving forward. I just wanted to highlight them. And then the last thing that I wanted to highlight, which I think is very, very important, and I think it's often not discussed in enough sort of depth and breadth, is rules for the digital economy. So a lot of the ASEAN working plans, APEC working plans, all highlight the importance of the regional economy and why this is instrumental for regional economic growth and MSMEs and Industry 4.0 and the next everything. But from a regulatory perspective, you still work in a space very diverse, where domestic approaches to regulating the digital economy are completely different. And unfortunately, we didn't have a WTO for digital economy agreements. So there is no baseline set of rules that countries can refer to say, I'm compliant or not compliant. So ASEAN has been very proactive, but you still have differing views as to how to approach digital taxation. So if I'm a company, if I'm a country, do I tax digital economy? The economy grew without, a taxation scheme and requirements. So not just things like corporate tax, which is very popular, but things like VAT and GST, things like import duties on digital products, where countries around the region differ as to whether you should impose import duties on digital products and whether you should respect the WTO moratorium on import duties on digital products, and things like de minimis. Is there a threshold that would allow, especially MSMEs or low shipment goods, to not pay customs duties or to not pay VAT or GST? And there's very, very different legislations even within ASEAN regarding these things. And if you look at it from the perspective of a small business trying to trade across the region, if the requirements and the taxation requirements differ across every single one of those legislations, then you might as well just sell domestically. So I think sorting those frictions and flattening them out would allow you to have a more sort of a more uniform market. And then you go into things like data privacy, consumer protection, cybersecurity, which are all legitimate government concerns. But the issue that you have right now is that government priorities and approaches to addressing these concerns vary widely. Some governments think that, you know, using multilateral spaces to then allow cross-border data flows. So they prioritize cross-border data flows, and you see that in the Cptp, and, you know, do not put data localization requirements, whereas other governments, you know, are not super happy to allow cross-border data flows, to not have data localization requirements, and to justify that from a data privacy and cybersecurity. So when you have differing views on this, then RCEP, it's not going to be the solution, but RCEP becomes part of a broader governance architecture that is trying to develop these rules. And I think Asia is at the forefront of this, right? So you don't have things like APEC. You have digital trade provisions on existing FTAs, Cptp, and the Digital Economy Agreement between Singapore and Australia. Of course, they're not perfect. There's exceptions, but they're more binding and more comprehensive than anything else out there. Then you have the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement between Singapore, Australia, and Chile, which has this modular approach. It has a lot of rules around, you know, next generation technologies like AI, blockchain, and it allows countries to join and, you know, and pick and choose which provisions they have. You have ongoing WTO conversations. You have ASEAN doing a lot of things around the Digital Integration Framework for Action Plan. They have the ASEAN E-commerce Agreement, and all of this sort of places in some way or another are prioritizing the digital regulatory issues that I've highlighted, and I've figured out a way to sort them out and to streamline them and harmonize them to different extents. Where does RCEP sit in all of this, you might ask? The scope is similar, but I mean, with reason, because the views of China, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and ASEAN regarding rules in digital economy are not very similar, and you can expect them to be. There's a lot of exceptions and a lot of carve-outs in terms of those rules. So, you know, now you have countries that have very specific domestic approaches to digital economy. You have a broader regional framework that allows you to try to streamline those. And I think when you look at something like RCEP, it makes it another forum, and I think quite a unique forum because of the members that would allow them to continue to develop common standards for digital trade. I don't think it's an easy task, but the reality is, if you cannot streamline all of these types of regulatory approaches, and if companies cannot move data between different countries, then you know, innovation might be stifled, and especially MSMEs or any business is not going to be able to develop a reliable, sustainable business model that allows them to sell and operate across multiple markets in the region. So I think with that, I just wanted to conclude and to sort of open up the questions. And yeah, happy to discuss, you know, how in a little bit more detail how I see RCEP rules sort of addressing some of the issues that I highlighted in my presentation.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for your presentation. I really liked the fact that, you know, you were very much at the forefront, actually questioning the potential impacts of RCEP. I mean, there's been a lot of, I think the mood has been a more celebratory one in the recent week, but I think you do put those questions out there. I mean, when you actually compare the tariffs from RCEP and the other agreements, I mean, it could be possible that the firms actually don't want to utilize them at all. So that's a very real question that, you know, we need to ask industry themselves, like how would they utilize this agreement, very much different from a policy perspective. And then of course, the other very important thing is about the digital economy. I mean, digitalization is much talked about now. I mean, it's a pandemic world where post-pandemic, I think the firms that do not digitize will actually lose out. But yet, as you rightly pointed out, I mean, differing rules in different countries. And so companies that want to go regional really face that restriction. And we've heard that from even some of the MNCs that want to, you know, locate in Malaysia. There's a lot of concern over data privacy and security issues, which actually can be overcome if I think there's a bit more collaboration and interaction from the regional partners. Okay, so I would like now to introduce the final speaker for the day, Tan-Sri Dr. Rebecca Santa Maria, who is, as I said, very proud to have her as a member of our board in ISEAS, but more importantly, she is also the executive director of the APEC Secretariat in Singapore, which serves as the advisory body and implementation arm and custodian of institutional memory for the 21 member economies that make up the APEC Forum. She was also, importantly, the Secretary General of the Malaysian Ministry of International Trade and Industry from 2010 to 2016. And in that role, she provided oversight for the formulation and implementation of Malaysia's international trade policies and positions, involving our participation in bilateral and regional multilateral fora. So she was very much within, in the room itself during the formation and negotiation of RCEP. Also at that time, the TPPA, which as we know, fell through. But on the regional front, Tan Sri Rebecca is a leading voice in ASEAN. She chaired the ASEAN Senior Economic Officials Meeting, as well as the ASEAN High-Level Task Force for Economic Integration, and was the ASEAN Chair for the ASEAN-India Trade in Goods Agreement and Chief Negotiator for the bilateral free trade agreements with India and Turkey. So she has a lot of negotiation experience on her. I think she would be well placed to talk to us about her thoughts and views on RCEP now that it has been signed, after being involved in the process within the ministry itself, as well as what comes ahead. And perhaps you can also share reflections on the other two speakers' presentations. So Tan Sri Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tricia. Good morning, Jayant and Juan, Sebastian. Always nice to be on the panel with you all. I like the detail with which you all went into tearing apart what went into RCEP. It's interesting to see how it's being analyzed. I just want to give some perspective on the rationale, the history behind, the genesis behind RCEP. And RCEP really was a child of pre-pandemic, and when you look at it today, the important thing to remember is when we were looking at RCEP in the early days, right from the get-go, we said this is a living document. So, the important aspect of reviewing and, taking on board developments, the dynamic nature of international trade, that is an important key, is a key in the document itself, that it is a living document. Like I said, we negotiated this in a different world. And today, when you look at it, does this make sense? But if we're coming at it from that perspective also, RCEP makes sense, because in this pandemic world, you see this growing skepticism around globalization, around international trade. And what RCEP, shows to the world is that, look, there is a place for regional integration. There is a place for us to get together and try and get ourselves, all of us, out of this situation that we're in. The whole discussions that Juan presented around value chains and supply chains, this is key in any free trade agreement. Just give me a second, please. And this is the trouble of working from home. Give me a second.
Okay, well, as we wait for Tan Sri Rebecca to return. Oh, there she is. Okay, very quick.
The reality of working from home. Give me a sec. Okay, done. So coming back to this. So, while we didn't anticipate the pandemic and how it was going to impact global value chains, so that conversation wasn't there at that time. But we knew that we needed to get our supply chains more connected, that regional economic integration was going to be the way of the future. And well, in a sense, the pandemic then affirms what we tried to do then, So that's an important point. The messaging around the regional economic integration, especially now. How do you manage supply chains?
Sorry, I think there's a bit of sound when you're like, I'm not sure when you're tapping the...
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, it was fine early on. Sorry.
All right, fine. Okay, is it better now? Is it better now?
Still there actually, for some reason. I'm not sure why.
Okay. I'm using my earphone, so you shouldn't be getting outside noise. Anyways, let's try again. So what we were very sure of when we negotiated RCEP was to bring in the parties, the +1 FTAs, as Juan has explained. That was done. That was the intention. And yes, it was very complicated. And that's why it took 8 years. And part of the complication was because the members, the +1s of ASEAN, did not have an FTA among themselves. So the value here also is the leadership of ASEAN in being able to bring these parties together to the table to negotiate an agreement among themselves, which they couldn't do on their own. So China, Japan and Korea, for the longest time, we've been talking of an FTA among themselves. But the success of ASEAN, excuse me, sorry, just
Well, I think those of us who have families at home can
yeah,
relate.
I know I have to say to make less noise. Okay, so again, so that's one strength that's not often, talked about, that ASEAN was able to bring these parties to the table and have an agreement of this nature. That was one of the reasons why it took such a long time, because to make sure these parties, even as ASEAN is negotiating this agreement, the other parties had to also negotiate among themselves and then bring it to the whole. So it was a very, very complex agreement. So that's one aspect. The other is when you compare CPTPP with RCEP, TPP and then CPTPP was pushed as the gold standard because it included the new next generation trade and investment issues, in human rights, government procurement disciplines, IP disciplines, those things, market access for government procurement, which you do not see in the RCEP. So folks then, diminish RCEP in that sense when they compare it to CPTP. But for me, look at what RCEP has done. RCEP, CPTPP was an agreement among equals. Everyone had to come to the table with the same rules. That's it. You're going to abide by the same disciplines. Absolutely. There could be exceptions worked in, but generally you're all equal. But in RCEP is, for me, a model for inclusive trade agreements. You have the likes of Myanmar and Laos and Cambodia on one side, and you have Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, So how do you bring all these disparate parties with different economic models and political models as well, to the table for one agreement, to find common ground and to take on board that developmental aspect for economies like Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. So from a different perspective, not so much a business perspective, but from a development, social economic perspective, RCEP is a model for us as we, to take forward. When we look at the developmental aspects that were managed in RCEP, whether it was for capacity building for SMEs, those are important parts. The economic cooperation, technical cooperation that's embedded in those agreements are just as important as talking of market access. When this, I think going forward, trade agreements are less about market access, but more about non-tariffs, those regulatory reforms that you need to make, so that we all get to making it easier to do business at the end of the day. So I think that's the perspective that we must take when we're looking at a trade agreement. If you go down to the nitty-gritties of the administrative costs for compliance, then, yes, that is true. I mean, that is a point for business. But we also must understand that these agreements are negotiated not for today, but for tomorrow. And that's why if you're looking at, you're saying, your table shows that ASEAN, Japan has 0 tariffs, but how long did it take to get this? When did it enter into force? So I mean, let's be clear about it. So don't diminish the work that's gone into RCEP when you compare it with older agreements that have been in force for the longest time. And one would think that yes, because they've been, and that's what can happen. ASEAN Japan, when we started negotiating it was crazy. It was, getting market access for some of our products was so difficult, but we did it. And then today you're seeing the benefits. So you don't get the benefits of a trade agreement in the 1-2 years. It takes, it takes time. And that's why we always say that you negotiate for the future. You negotiate for to ensure that your investment environment gets more transparent, more predictable. These are the values that an agreement brings to the table. And in the context of RCEP, I think we've set out to do that. We've achieved it. It was very complex, and that's why you get these pages and pages for rules. But having said that, this is a living document. So the pandemic clearly will, when we're up to rethinking some of the things that we've put in place, it will have us look at this agreement differently, especially in strengthening our supply chains, the resilience of our supply chains. That is an aspect none of us thought about in all our agreements. But I think going forward, this is something that we will need to think about. How do you ensure that during pandemics, how will this agreement help us to manage that, anticipate that? You know, we've gone forward now where we've got different declarations. APEC just had a declaration on movement of essential goods. You know, APEC also had we've created a campaign site for us to share information. But one would think that, you know, maybe going forward, these are things that need to be embedded in FTAs, you know, so that you have that level of certainty worked into those FTAs, facilitating essential movement across borders during pandemics. Can we not put that in? And in anticipation of, you know, we didn't do all that because we didn't see it. But, you know, so even as I say that we're looking at negotiations for the future, this is something that we need to take on board. And in the review process, because RCEP is a living document, the review process, they must factor in all these, you know, and not have this agreement just cast in stone. One aspect of RCEP, besides being developmental, is also the point about structural reform. I think that's another area that needs to be emphasized. We need to have that. Sometimes you need outside pressure to have domestic changes that businesses require. So that's one area. The other is also the, you know, there is this concept of built-in agenda. We need to look at it, and that built-in agenda must take place faster than we thought. You know, built-in agenda for some of it will be when it's fully implemented, not when it enters into force. So, I mean, these are things to think about so that then it makes sense for business. If you're building right now, you don't have, for example, ISDS. You're going to say for that, you go and look at other agreements that you sign, you know. But if you only want to have it as a comprehensive and holistic agreement, and you have the ISDS in a built-in agenda, and you're going to wait for what, 5 years to do that, I think that's not going to be exactly good for business, for your investment environment, if you're looking at predictability and you know, transparency. So the built-in agenda has to be hastened. So that's something that I think the folks in ASEAN need to think through. I will stop here because, I mean, I can go on about things that need to be done with RCEP, given the benefit of hindsight. Like, you know, when we started, it was really us trying to bring the parties together. One party wanted ASEAN +3, another party wanted ASEAN +6. You know, so when Mari Pangestu was Minister of Trade, when we talked about this in Bali, I remember how do we resolve this? It was going on for eons, you know, trying to see what we can do. And this is where we arrived at an inclusive agreement. It could be a +2, +3, +4, +5, +6, whatever. And it's an open accession. So tomorrow, if US or Russia wants to join and they can meet, it's like Cptp, really open accession. So those are some of the positives from RCEP. The most important message from me to this group is that it shows, in spite of everything, the leadership of ASEAN managed to get this done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tan Sri Rebecca, for your very candid views. I think the direct experience on the ground, there's no match for that, because you're actually talking about bringing these countries to the table when they have so, you know, varied interests, varied incentives. I mean, domestically already, it's so difficult to convince people about any value of a trade agreement, and what more so with a group of very varying countries with very different backgrounds. And as you say, political, economic histories as well. So thank you very much, Tan Sri, and thank you to all the three speakers for your excellent remarks. We have quite a lot of time now to get into the discussion. So we've got, you know, more than 45 minutes to get into it. So we already have some questions, and you know, internally, of course, we also have some questions that we would love to explore with you. But let me start with, I think I will sort of group them according to the theme, and then and then I'll see if there are any other questions. So for any of you out there, please put your questions in the Q&A box below, and then I'll try and get through the questions. So let's go back to Dr. Jayant, right? So there's a question here about how would mutual, I think this is about the opening of borders and the kind of things that you were trying to put forward. So the question is, how would mutual recognition of quarantine work in practice when public health policy tells us that we want to limit mixing of people from different communities to limit transmission? So yeah, let's talk about that, and then later we can go back to talking about RCEP. So this is just section of it. We talk about kind of pandemic, post-pandemic recovery first.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Tricia. Yes, I think this question pretty much highlights the difficulties we are facing in opening borders. And by that, I mean this implicit view out there that we should not be mixing communities, or we should not be importing the virus from outside communities defined by nations or nationality. That's not true. The health experts tell us we shouldn't be mixing communities defined by health infection rates, right? That's all that matters in this case. It's not a national issue. It's not a nationality issue. It's about different rates of infection in different communities, right? So I was having this discussion with a former colleague of mine in Manila, and and we talked about this. And for instance, if I were to travel to Vietnam every day this week to do my shopping, and of course, if I'm in Vietnam, I'll go, sightseeing and so on. And if he travels every day to the next city to do his shopping, next city to Manila to do his shopping, he is much more likely to be a health risk than me because of the different infection rates in those two groupings of communities. Philippines, where, less than, more than 90% of countries have a higher infection rate. Singapore and Vietnam don't have the same concerns. But anyway, so I think that's the key point here. So quarantine can be easily recognized in these two countries without adding to health risks in any significant way. There's always a problem. Of course, if you want to eliminate the virus, close your borders, then also, you have to think about your domestic restrictions as well. But let me just finish by saying, this is a common concern. In fact, I think it's not happening because politicians are particularly concerned about it, right? So if you import the virus, let's say, then you're seen as being irresponsible, right? So you've not done your job of providing security to your nation. Security from a deadly virus. But if you have a news spread domestically, you're unlucky, or oh, that's just too bad, maybe we should tighten things. It's not seen as carrying the same political costs. And I think that's what we need to overcome, because the science tells us that it's a very different problem from what community perceptions currently exist, and how politicians respond to those community perceptions. So so let me stop there.
Okay, well, there's a few more coming in just on this particular theme. So I'll just read them out to see if you want to talk about it. And then I think after this, we'll try and move on into like the actual content of RCEP. So one question is about, with the opening of borders, would there be forecasts of the volume of traffic? As you know, it's very important for the recovery of the aviation economy in Southeast Asia. And a related one is, well, I mean, it goes back to the question of like balancing the two, right? So the question from Raymond is, the economic benefit of a loose lockdown is complicated by humanitarian considerations, making policy choices difficult. And would the loss of human lives be less important than economic growth? So, I mean, you can answer that, but I think essentially what you have said already is that it's not necessarily one or the other. If you want to just, have a final comment on that, and then we can move into the economic question.
Sure. Okay, so yes, so I think that's an important point. At one level, it's about balancing health and economy, but at a different level, depending on the country. You see, this has been too, if you like, US focused. In the US, you have people like Ann Kruger saying, you know, there is no trade-off, right? Health and economy are one and the same, right? And here she's responding to the horrible situation in the US, right? Where, you know, people are talking about it in a different context, where countries can afford to subsidize you to stay at home. But in poor countries, there is no trade-off for in a different way. Lives and livelihoods are one and the same for other reasons, right? This is why lockdowns don't work in India or even the Philippines, right? If you don't have running water in your home, or if you have to scavenge or beg for a living, or you have a daily wage job, you cannot lock down if the government doesn't pay you to stay alive. And many of these governments cannot do that and haven't done that effectively, right? And that's why lockdowns have not worked. And this is why I think Indonesia has recognized that, has done well, given its circumstances, not to do general lockdown and have the double whammy of, you know, economic and health crisis. But on the tourism issue again, well, we know, I haven't seen forecasts, but I know that people say it'll take 2-3 years before we get back to so-called normal on the travel side. But we know what's happening now. It's almost zero, right? Almost all tourism income and related, they're multiplier effects here that we have to consider. In fact, I think the World Tourism Authority estimates that 1 in 10 jobs on average is related to tourism and travel. So there's a huge job-related factor here that we need to consider in opening borders, which is critical and can provide a huge boost at this time. You know, the vaccine is on the horizon, but it's going to take a long time before we all are able to get it in large numbers, right? The logistics is still going to be complicated. So we have to start thinking about border opening in a calibrated way going forward. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Jayant. All right, so the next group of questions, I'm going to put them together, is essentially about the membership of RCEP. So now we really talk about RCEP again, and there's a lot of interest about, you know, India and China and so on. So I'll get into the specifics now. So we know that India declined to sign RCEP, or rather it pulled out from RCEP over fears of trade imbalances and national interests being undermined, especially against China. So I'll leave this set of questions open to anyone who wants to answer. So how do you see this, especially with regard to the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy that includes ASEAN? Another question related would be, what would it take to get India back into RCEP? And then there are, you know, sort of questions surrounding China as well, right? So we know that before RCEP, China was already seen as one of ASEAN's biggest trading partners, and the China-ASEAN FTA was already being signed like a decade ago. So what's your view of the speculation of ASEAN centrality being under threat by the presence of China in RCEP? So I can leave that to anyone who wants to answer. Basically, India, as well as China, and well, okay, someone's just asked, will RCEP be a bargaining chip for the South China Sea dispute? So China, India, and South China Sea. So if anyone wants to take this set of questions, please go ahead. Sebastian, do you want to?
Sure. I'll give the economic perspective. Yeah, I'll try not to get into geopolitics of it. And I think just a bit in response to some of the remarks that Dr. Rebecca gave and some of the question, it's the idea of generally there's no evidence that, you know, trade agreements all of a sudden create, you know, completely different economic systems and supply chains. It's more about how do you create rules that strengthen and allow you to build more resilient economic relationships between countries. That is the case in ASEAN, that is the case in NAFTA in the United States. And I think a question that you have now, especially with the recovery in COVID, is how do you get nations who have diametrically opposing approaches to regulating trade to support economic relations that exist between them? And I think, I mean, coming from Latin America, where most attempts to do that have failed, I think Asia presents a good case study because it's a case where economic relations already exist. You're not trying to, I mean, you can develop, you can enforce them, but I mean, if you look at the textiles and apparel supply chain, footwear supply chain, semiconductors, electronic supply chain, those are supply chains that incorporate North and East Asia. And because of the US-China trade war, are increasingly incorporating countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, right? So you have deeply ingrained economic relationships between those countries. The question is, how do you ensure that frictions are less, that those opportunities become more accessible to different players, especially smallers? How do you promote innovation within that context? And I think when you look at something like China, it makes a lot of sense to have a trade agreement between China, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN, because so many supply chains have that structure and have end markets within those countries. So I think it just makes a lot of sense to have that in place. I think when the frustration comes from, not from me, but from a lot of the firms that you have, is that they're planning their supply chain and they want to see the cost, right? They don't half-size it, or they might ask you, I don't like that regulation, why haven't you changed it? It's seamless. And I think what gets often disguised is that it's very, very difficult to get countries to modify domestic level regulations to meet broader trade demands. And I think something like RCEP, it's very, very interesting because it's getting countries like Indonesia, India at a point, and China to talk about these issues that they would not talk about anywhere else. So let's not get under the illusion that all of these countries are going to join Cptpp all of a sudden, because those rules are more robust, and joining Cptpp will require an incredible level of domestic level reform that goes against many of the national plans that those countries have in place. So I think RCEP does become a place where you can develop rules, for the future between like-minded countries that can actually support existing supply chains. And I think a lot of the discussion about China, geopolitics, and control, sure, you can think about that, but I think fundamentally is, if I'm a firm, if I'm an electronics manufacturer, in Asia, can I, do that in a more seamless and cost-effective way, in a way that would enable like regional competitiveness, right? So then you're talking about regulations, not just on trading goods, but in the services required to make that little thing, in the what data flows required to manufacture that, in the standards for those products, increasingly in the standards for the software, right? China versus US democratic. So I think about integrating all those standards, I think that's why something like RCEP makes a huge difference from an economic perspective. But of course, a lot to do, and of course we're hoping for sort of implementation and revision, because I think there's a lot of potential there. Yeah.
Thank you, Sebastian. Well, there's a question that's kind of related to what you said, but you did talk about it, but very specifically, like, what would you see are the advantages or the disadvantages of China and RCEP? So just kind of zeroing in on that.
Economic perspective. I'm not going to get into geopolitics.
Sure.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I think China is the biggest manufacturer and consumer market in the region, and you need to have it. And if you don't have a trade agreement with China, you're sort of losing in that from a competitor's perspective. So having China in a trade agreement, especially as the WTO has, I wouldn't say failed, but it's struggling to develop rules that keep up with some of the Chinese regulations in general. But I mean, China is generally like a benchmark of what regulations are in place in terms of digital trade. Having in place an agreement with China where you can work with China in developing rules that will facilitate between you and China is very important, because when it comes to digital trade and customs procedures, China has very, very particular regulations, and firms need to be very, very large to be able to manage all of that at the same time, whether it's localizing your data within the China, or it's using China networks, so it's dealing with Chinese customs and classification procedures and paperwork. It's very, very difficult. So if you are able to create a dialogue space, that allows you to bring China and then have discussions about all these things and work progressively to streamline them, I think that's hugely important. And I think and something that it gets often taken out from conversations out of the US, out of Europe, is just that China is a huge consumer market, and if you're part of a broader agreement that allows you to tap and be competitive in that market, that can be huge, for countries here in the region and for firms operating in the region. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Sebastian. All right, so we've talked, about post-pandemic and borders, and then we've also talked about like China and India. So let's talk about the agreement itself. So this kind of goes into the presentation that Sebastian made, but also I suppose the perspective from Tan Sri Rebecca as well, encouraging us to see it from like a long-term historical view. I like that view as well, that the benefits that we are seeing from some of these agreements are essentially agreements that were negotiated and signed a long time ago. So yes, we may not see the benefits of RCEP today, but we will see that in the future. So then I'm going to group these questions together. So RCEP is good, but it's presented as if there's still a lot of variation among countries to facilitate trade. In this regard, is RCEP expected, and is it expected to bring increased FDI in the future? And then, okay, so in terms of understanding the economic benefit of RCEP, what is the view on the expected balance on trade creation versus trade diversion? So that's on the content. I'm trying to group things together. And then I think I'm going to link this also now to CPTPP, because we're talking about the content, right? So, there's a lot of focus on harmonizing tariffs, and how much of a role does RCEP play in reducing non-tariff barriers or reducing barriers for cross-border investments? Do we expect ASEAN to become a hub for this kind of high technology, high value economic activities? And maybe I'll stop there because there's quite a lot already. So let's focus on the content side. Maybe any of you can answer, Sebastian or Tan Sri Rebecca.
Yeah,
you would like.
Yeah. One of the push factors for us to get into RCEP really was the possibility of engaging more deeply with China and India. Those two were really the high points of us when we wanted to do this. So when we got involved, when we began the process of RCEP. And for me, the fact that India at the end of it said that it wasn't ready to take on the commitments of RCEP, it's a pity, because it would have made so much of a difference. The integration of the region would have been really more meaningful when you have ASEAN in the middle, you have India, you have China, and then you have Australia, New Zealand, and the northern part of Asia. Really would have been a solid coup for ASEAN. So for now, India is not quite ready, but we hope the doors open, as I said, and when India comes in, India takes on whatever it's negotiated, so it doesn't have to renegotiate, as it were, So the door is open, they can come in, and I'm sure ASEAN and other partners would be more than happy to have India with it. The value of trade agreements is also the aspect of structural reform, of looking at our rules, streamlining our rules, having deeper mutual recognition agreements across the region, so that so market access is not just about tariffs, but also the facilitation aspect. How do we get, the ultimate goal is to have this seamless movement of goods. So that's the way to look at it. And therefore it will take time, because structural reform takes time. But the important thing is having folks at the table talking about it. This is a platform that is so important. And I know Sebastian talked about the dialogue. This is continuing, science still delivered. No, it's not, because there is this continued engagement. It's not once we've signed it, we're done. No. So that continuation of that dialogue to keep improving, to see how we can make things even better in terms of the investment environment. And that's why I go back to the built-in agenda. That is where we need to, if we really want to make a difference going forward, we need to hasten the built-in agenda. We all experience negotiation fatigue, after 8 years. So you want to take a big breather and say, but no, I think it's important to keep us all at the table, looking at ways to improve it, especially given what's going on now, with COVID and the recovery that we're looking at. So important for us to not rest on our laurels. Oh, big deal, we signed it, but to keep that engagement going, the dialogue going.
Since you're on right now, Tan Sri, there's some questions directed to you specifically. So one is that now that RCEP is concluded, which aspects of it fell short of your expectations, having had the benefit of the inside view from its early discussions, as well as, you can feel free to answer this or not. Were there any geopolitical issues that your organization faced? Well, I think the person means your ministry in MITI faced in the process of the ratification, and how did you fix this?
No, I think let me go back to my expectations. As a person who was involved from the beginning, my main thing was looking at the investment environment as well. And so the fact that the investment, the protection part is left as a built-in agenda, that sort of disappointed me. That's one. So I hope the sooner they get into it, the better. There are models now with, I think the Cptpp model for investor protection is something that is worth looking at. It is not quite the bits kind of protection that we've done in the past. So that's something to do. The other is also, we should do more for services, the domestic regulation aspect of services, because you can have, well, very successfully, I think we've got negative listing for services, but at the end of the day, services liberalization is really about domestic regulation. So that aspect, I think, needs to be more rigorous, more defined. So just very simply, those two areas, for me, we really need to do a lot more work there.
Okay, thank you so much, Tan Sri. All right, so you mentioned the Cptpp, and that's been also at the forefront of the discussion. As I mentioned earlier in the introduction, the Malaysian government has recently said that we are going to focus on RCEP now, and Cptpp, yes, it has been pursued by the government, in fact agreed upon, but the timeline is not in the near future. I think it's left a sort of open timeline on the Cptpp. So do you have any thoughts on the Cptpp? Any of you? There's a question about, with Biden as the president-elect, actually he's talking about RCEP, but no, okay, I'm going to change that to, is there a possibility for the USA to re-enter negotiations to join the Cptpp? There's also a question about comparing RCEP to Cptpp. Is it fair to say that Cptpp would offer actually higher quality export opportunities for ASEAN, especially for members like Malaysia who are transitioning to high income nation status? And yes, I mean, as you pointed out, Tan Sri Rebecca, RCEP actually also did not have some of the important chapters that Cptpp would have in terms of the higher standards on labor, environment, the role of state-owned enterprises, transparency, anti-corruption. Those were not present for RCEP. So, RCEP's more seen as like a tool to promote regional trade and harmonizing the rules perhaps, but increasing governance and promoting sustainable market competition, perhaps that would be more along the Cptpp lines. So in short, like, what are the prospects of Cptpp now that RCEP is signed? Dr. Jayant or Sebastian or Tan Sri, please feel free. Yes, Dr. Jayant.
Right. Okay. So, but before I talk about that, I think there was also a question earlier about trade creation and trade diversion with RCEP, which I think is a useful discussion as well. I think, trade theory tells us that the larger the grouping and the lower the difference between internal and external barriers, the lower the potential for trade diversion and the higher the potential for trade creation. So RCEP meets those criteria broadly. It's quite a large grouping, 1/3 of the world's output. And, most of these countries, it's very diverse, but most of these countries are relatively open, engaged heavily in trade, and so on. So the potential is there to minimize trade diversion and increase trade creation. But, we can eliminate the potential for trade diversion if we multilateralize fully. right? If these already low tariffs are offered to everyone on a non-discriminatory basis. This will take away, all of the compliance costs, right? Because there's nothing to comply with, no preferences to be applied for. I'm not talking again about this happening on day one, but this should be, an objective towards, diminishing the margin of preference over time. It's good that RCEP has one rule of origin, consolidating all of them, but the best rule of origin is the non-existent one, right? So when you multilateralize your preferences, you no longer need rules of origin, and this will significantly reduce the burden, especially on small firms, small and medium-sized firms that are still, confused by the myriad of agreements they need to choose from and comply with when they are trying to start exporting for the first time. Luckily, a lot of the non-tariff issues, it's just the key, I think, the kinds of regulatory convergence that RCEP is really about, those things are naturally multilateral. By that, I mean, you cannot actually prevent free riding, or you cannot very easily or cheaply exclude non-members from taking advantage of these things. But, that's a good thing, right? So these reforms are naturally non-discriminatory. They cannot be sort of, negotiated in exchange for other reforms. So they are available to anyone who chooses to use them. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And that also can become more, you can increase the degree to which they are multilateral through concerted efforts to do so. By, for instance, making sure that, you don't exclude countries through, sets of forms and so on that they need to fill. But once you have these sort of reforms in place, then you simply allow everyone to access them. So I think that's the way in which you can actually really take advantage of the opportunity that RCEP presents, but again, gradually over time. On Cptp and RCEP, again, as I mentioned, I think Premier Xi's intention to rejoin or to try and join Cptpp is a key factor here, and provides the opportunity to revive the APEC-wide FTAAP that I think is probably a way in which excluded members can save face and come in and say, okay, maybe Cptpp has gone through too much already in the US for them to rejoin, but they could join. They are already in APEC, and they could join this new agreement, and that might be one way to marry the two going forward. But let me stop there.
Right.
Sorry, Tricia, just to add, I think there was a question on the geopolitics. I think I need to clarify. In ASEAN, there are the three pillars, right? The economic pillar, the social-cultural pillar, and the political security pillar. And the negotiations was purely done by the economic pillar, I must say this. And the folks involved were also from the economic side. So while there may have been the shadow of the geopolitics, at the table, we were very focused on the economic side of things. We were not distracted by the politics of it. Likewise, I'm going to take us back to APEC for a bit. That question about US-China tension always comes up whenever we have a forum on APEC, discussions on APEC. Yes, there is that shadow there, but it's very important that we have the parties at the table in the context of APEC, that you have the parties at the table. It's more important to have them at the table than not at the table at all. So in the same way with RCEP, it was important for us to have the parties at the table. And for me, it's a loss. Personally, I feel it very strongly that India decided to opt out, because having India engaged would have made a lot of difference to to the regional integration, to looking at rules and disciplines across the region to facilitate trade. If you're looking at supply chains and value chains, if we're all at the table discussing it, it's better than not being at the table. So, and if you're talking about standards and rules at the border, rules behind the border rules, it's always better to have parties as significant as India at the table. So I'm hoping, I'm ever the optimist, hoping at some point India will come in. Very important also in all this is the business community, the voice of the business community. When we are negotiating, it's not just policymakers sitting around the table and negotiating, but it's also the voice of the businesses. What is it that the business would like to see us do? And that engagement between the policymakers and the business community value adds to that discussion, makes it more meaningful. And in the Cptpp, we had that additional layer of civil society that we needed to engage, because trade is also seen as an impact on the person on the street. There is that reality. So because the Cptpp had, or the TPP rather at that time, had a lot of disciplines that were worked into the agreement. So that's why the engagement with civil society was just as important. I think there was another, I'm trying to recall some of the questions that were asked, comparing RCEP with Cptpp and why we don't have some of those disciplines. I think it's really, in all negotiations, you find middle ground. And to arrive at that middle ground, we needed to back burner some of those more challenging matters. For example, state-owned enterprises, disciplines on state-owned enterprises. When you're talking of competition and how it impacts competition in an economy, you have to, where there are economies that have a big presence of state-owned enterprises, this is a conversation that we must have. So while we did not include that in the RCEP, it is again in its built-in agenda. And that's for that reason I say, get quickly to your built-in agenda. You don't drag your feet. So that's where we're at.
Thank you so much, Tan Sri. I think Sebastian has something to say, yes.
Yeah. Just on the Cptpp question, I think, of course, and just thinking about countries who are arguing, like Malaysia, I have RCEP, why do I need Cptpp? And I think that's a relevant question, because you can look at RCEP and you say more countries and tariffs will drop to zero, slower, but eventually they go to zero. And I think, like Dr. Rebecca said, export competitiveness. What does it mean to be export competitive, 21st century moving forward? And tariffs are the least of your concern, right? And I think a lot of the domestic discourse forgets that trade agreements are about reciprocal relations. And to be export competitive, you need to have access to a lot of things and facilitation in other markets. That includes, inward and outward investment, right? So can you invest in other countries? Can you ensure that those investments are protected? Can you invest in different types of sectors? What about, can you compete in the government procurement sector, right? So large markets, if you have very competitive healthcare products, can you compete in the public healthcare system? In most countries, you can't. Things like regulatory certainty, right? So how do I know that, if a pandemic hits, this other country is just not going to slap tariffs and export controls and you just kick me out of the country? And I think RCEP has the shell, but Cptpp by far is the most comprehensive agreement in terms of a wide array of countries from different regulatory perspectives that has very, very solid rules that guarantee all of these things that actually matter for trade, right? If you take what is electronics product, right? You care about the investment that goes into it, the investment that will go into those countries, the services required to deliver that, whether you can sell those products, to a broader government procurement, whether that investment is protected. And key is, if something like COVID hits, are there transparency provisions in place so that the other country is accountable for, discriminating against my product? And there is no question the Cptpp is the best at doing that. Of course, the RCEP has a built-in agenda that would, allow it to get there. But and you talk to companies here in the region and you look at a market like Vietnam. Vietnam is very far from being able to implement a lot of the commitments that they've put into the EU agreements and the Cptpp. but the fact that they are committed, that there's that level of regulatory certainty, right, would make even partners like the US attractive. Like, to think that you can negotiate with the US on RCEP terms is a bit ridiculous, because the Cptp agenda is an US agenda. And with a Biden administration, requirements on labor and requirements on environmental practices are going to be the priority. So
Sebastian is a little bit
is at an advantage because of things on the TPP and with the EU. So I think thinking about your specific competitiveness in relation to key export markets and all the things that are not the tariff that matters for you can be key for a country like Malaysia. And I think you'll be left behind when you realize that, you know, to be competitive in all these other markets that you want to be competitive, that requires robust commitments. And unfortunately, RCEP just doesn't have that yet. So while that doesn't exist, join Cptp and start exploring those opportunities, because that would just increase the probability of, you know, a successful Biden negotiation. And even, I mean, I don't want to get into EU negotiations because I know that's a very difficult topic, especially in Malaysia, but, you know, even strengthen, you know, the nature of being able to have that access. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Sebastian. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes more to go. I have a couple of questions more still, but I was just wondering whether there were any points that, like, the three of you speakers would like to respond to each other on, because, you know, sometimes we end the webinar and then the speakers finally like, oh, you know, I like your point, or I disagree with you, and I thought that it would be nice for us to do that a little bit here. And especially, I think there was one point earlier, I'm not sure whether that's already been sufficiently addressed, but feel free to talk about that. I think there was that slide that Sebastian put out about comparing RCEP with the other agreements, right? And about, like, whether or not the firms would actually make use of RCEP because they had other agreements and that infrastructure already in place, with the benefit, of course, like of having had them signed many years ago. So I don't know if that's Rebecca or maybe Sebastian, you want to respond to that. I just think it would be nice to have like a little bit of interaction between among the three of you.
Sure, I just make a quick comment on that. I completely agree with Dr. Rebecca, and just a quick comment that I had. I work with a lot of firms, and it is admirable how the use of ASEAN trade agreements have been socialized to the extent that firms don't know they're using FTAs. So they just use Form D, Form E, Form AZ, because that's just a standard trade compliance. And of course, that's what you want. You know, you don't want firms to have, you know, this very complicated infrastructure, but you just want them to fill out the form. And a lot of them are incredibly competent at using that. So I definitely see the long term. But I think also from a firm perspective, especially from an MSME perspective, an issue is that underutilization of trade agreements. And I know you cannot please everyone, but I just think that what I wanted to highlight with a slide like that is that it's just very, very, very complicated. And as a policymaker, you should not be surprised that smaller companies or most companies are just not utilizing those agreements. Because, you know, if all I do is sign Form D, like I'm a trade compliance officer and I just get Form D from my supplier, and then I get the zero cut, it's hard for you to expect me to then look at tariff concessions and go into the RCEP form or look at Cptpp and self-certify, because that's just so far beyond from my reality. And I think there's need to be a lot more emphasis in how, I mean, not just the rules, but then how do you socialize these commitments into firms, especially when it's so complex. It's, yeah, that's what I want to say.
And are there examples of good, what you refer to as good socialization of these agreements to the firm level in other countries? Because I mean, we've also been talking about Cptpp, and of course many other countries are at the policy level trying to consider the exact same challenge, right, in terms of getting the firms to understand how this could be of benefit. And you're talking about, say, like a small farmer in a small town somewhere in, I don't know, Australia or New Zealand, and likewise, you know, what that would mean for a small trader here.
Yes, I think something that a partner like the EU gets. So when the EU signs an FTA, they know that once that gets ratified, then the work starts. That's the mentality. So, I mean, of course, you can go 10 years negotiated, but when you ratify, that's when the work starts. And it is difficult. And I think you need to get it to the point where a firm will start understanding their own corporate strategy through the lens of FTAs. So they need to think, oh, FTA, I need to check about it, you know. And that requires resources, guides, export development consultants, and all of those things. I think a limitation that I see working in some of the countries in ASEAN is that a lot of the times you sign it and you're like, yay, enable investment. Here is, a 5-page guide. And so then what ends up happening is that it ends up being very expensive trade compliance consultants and large MNCs, the ones that read the agreements and blah, blah, blah. But a small firm with no trade compliance person cannot really do that. And of course, something like the ATIGA has facilitated that to an extent, even though some firms still do not use it. So, but I think the challenge is now that you've negotiated things like Cptp, like RCEP, which are fundamentally better, but more complicated. There's a lot of hand holding and a lot of sharing of guides, of initiatives, of systems. And I mean, the EU has a lot of them that would ensure that firms are increasingly aware of how this makes them more competitive. Because even a place like Singapore with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, many trade agreements, still struggles to get, its own firms to use those FTAs. So it's challenging. I'll give you that.
I think when I was in government, this is one of the things that we really considered. How do you translate this very complex agreement so that the person on the street can understand, so that the SMEs can understand? And then there is that role of bodies like, for example, in the case of Malaysia, the SME Development Corporation. That's one. MATRADE, the Trade Promotion Organization. And the business associations, these folks also, I mean, there are 20,000 pages, but you don't have to look at the 20,000 pages. You just need to focus on your area, the products that you are producing, So there is a way of narrowing it. And so there is this role. It's a joint role between business and governments to really work to make sure that the benefits accrue to especially the small companies. And I remember in Malaysia, we had this conversation with the MNCs to say, you have less of an issue because you have the resources to tap into all this. But what about your chain, your supply chain, those vendors to you? How do you help them, also benefit from? And in that process, you too benefit because of the supply chain. Everyone down the line has access to some of the preferences. So that sort of engagement is important. And I must credit, my colleagues from MITI who took on this job after the agreements were signed, to make sure that the benefits accrue to especially the small and medium enterprises.
Thank you very much. All right, so I think what we'll do now, we have not much time left to get into anything very substantive. So I will read out the remaining questions, and then I think I'll give each of you between 2 to 3 minutes just for your very closing remarks. Feel free to address the question or address a point that's been brought up by any one of the three of you, and then also what are your final thoughts about RCEP and of course, post-pandemic. And if you would like to comment on Malaysia, I mean, we're actually right now at the time of debating the budget for the next year. I mean, I think that also sits quite nicely in terms of, what does the 2021 outlook, what is that going to be for the country? All right, so there's a question about what's the difference between before and after the signing of RCEP. I think it's just too soon to tell, it's just happened. Sorry, I've just answered that for you. And the second question is, will this lead to a single market system similar to the one in the EU? And finally, would RCEP be driven as a quick win, while Cptpp is seen as more strategic approach, especially with the mounting challenges having to deal with the current pandemic? Yeah, so I think there's a lot of interest about, say the structural opportunities for reform that Tan Sri Rebecca pointed out. And I mean, we've talked about structural reform for a long time, but what is that even more important now, I suppose, thinking about a post-pandemic world? So let's perhaps go in order, starting from Dr. Jayant.
Okay, all right, thanks, Tricia. Well, I guess, in terms of these questions that you just read out, so RCEP was going to take a long time before we see any direct impacts that can be attributed to the many accords within the agreement. But I think organizations or agreements like RCEP can still operate in the short run by using the machinery available to pursue other pressing problems. And currently the problem is recovery. And that's why I've talked about using ASEAN or the RCEP sort of framework or machinery to help with the multilateralization of bilateral travel bubbles between members of that grouping. Those things can happen not deriving from the detailed provisions of the agreements, but by the machinery that these sorts of institutions provide, the opportunity to get together and do these things and cooperate in a informal way sometimes, but sometimes more formal way. So I think that's what we have to do right now. And one area is opening up borders. In terms of whether it'll be like EU, I certainly hope not. I think the EU has more lessons to, teach us about things to avoid rather than emulate, going too far too quickly. And also, this temptation of looking inward by being, convinced that we are self-sustaining, right? And RCEP, I don't think will fall victim to that, but we should always, keep the doors open and keep looking outward. I actually think that, the low rates of utilization of FTAs are not necessarily a bad thing all the time. If you look at why the utilization rates are low, if they are low because the margins of preference are low, that's actually a good thing, right? So people don't use them because there's not much preference to be gained. If that is the case, then I think FTAs have served their real role of helping regionalism promote globalization. And I think ASEAN's a classic example, right? More than 95% of tariff lines have zero margin of preference. There's no difference between the ATIGA rate and the MFN rate. And that's a great achievement. So low rates of intra-ASEAN trade are actually a sign of success. There's no trade diversion, right? But ASEAN has helped promote trade, right? All trade, all kinds of trade with the world, not with each other only through preferences. And so I think that's what these agreements should really try and do in the longer term, and that's promote globalization and promote non-discriminatory trade or trade creation rather than trade diversion.
All right, thank you. And Sebastian?
Sure. I just want to sort of quickly touch not just the idea of utilization, but broader rules on how to facilitate trade and the importance of stakeholder engagement, like Dr. Ruka said, especially private sector. I think once you look at how trade works in the region, it's not just MSMEs, it's freight forwarders, logistics service providers, law firms, the MNCs, the suppliers, and they all need to understand why this matters to their business model. And especially technology service providers. I think in the case of MSMEs, there's a huge gap between their ability to leverage technologies to access new markets, and whether it is, just an ERP or a train management software or supplier management software or the ability to leverage e-commerce platforms. That is a huge gap there. And I think when you're thinking about why are MSMEs not scaling and selling in a lot of places, it's usually because they don't have the tools and they don't have the staff that MNC has to sort through all these issues. So I would think emphasize a lot of stakeholder engagement and also digitalization for MSMEs, which I think would allow you to more swiftly implement this particular agreement and other agreements, and to ensure that, that whether it's utilization rates or just engagement in trade, goes up.
All right, thank you, Sebastian. Yes, I mean, we didn't get enough time to talk about the digital side of things, but I think your slides said that very well. Tan Sri.
Yeah, thank you. The dying moments. Agree with all that has been said by Jayant and Sebastian. And for me, I stress the role of government, because it is that will to implement structural reforms. compliance is one thing, but to make sure you go in with your eyes open and really not just have rhetoric saying, oh, I'm part of this agreement, but really making sure that the structural reform is there. And that's why, you know, in the case of Malaysia, for example, if Malaysia is serious about the Cptpp, start looking at structural reform, start looking at what needs to be done so that you can have that level of compliance, which is important. Governance, transparency, predictability of rules and regulations. We get into trouble when it comes to opaque rules and regulations. And that's the value of trade agreements. They make sure that you have less of those opaqueness in your rules and regulations. So if we can get there, only then can we talk of accession to the CPTPP. Really, the ratification of CPTPP really depends on our willingness. When I say our, I mean government's willingness to make sure our rules and regulations are as transparent and predictable as possible.
All right, thank you so much, Tan Sri, and thank you to all the three panelists for spending your Tuesday morning with us, as well as all who have stayed throughout.